We're here because we believe that Bishop George Bell's reputation has got to be restored in full. It's been proved that he's not guilty of the horrible crime that we were told he committed. It's been proved by Lord Carlisle, one of the finest lawyers we've got, ironically brought in by the Church of England to look into the matter, and then, of course, he turned volte-face and said, no chance that he was guilty. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all here and say, I think we're on a very, very special mission, and we're now a good way down that road, and again, welcome.
So let us remember from George Bell's lovely hymn, let love's unconquerable might God's people everywhere unite in service to the Lord of light. And that surely is a very concise summary of the life and ministry for which we give thanks in our prayer and at our gathering this morning. So, God of peace, we thank you for the faithfulness of your Bishop and Pastor George Bell, and especially for his love and care for those unjustly treated and all who are marginalized. We bless you for sustaining him with the courage always to proclaim your truth and justice, and so to work for peace and unity, and often in the face of disapproval in his own nation. Just as he followed your son's teaching, that we, along with our enemies and all your children, may we stand with your Christ, our Saviour, in his hour of grieving, that at length with your bishop we too may enter your country, where there is no sorrow nor sighing, but fullness of joy and life everlasting in you. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord and Redeemer, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, God, for ever and ever. Amen.
Well, I'm going to you have to have me again. I'm reading Bishop Nicholas's lovely, lovely statement. I hope I do it justice. Thank you for your invitation to share a few thoughts about Bishop Bell and the events of recent years. I do so in a significantly less charged atmosphere than prevailed when this society, and indeed the Bishop George Bell Group, met in the past. The winning of our settled position owes much to Richard Simons and the Bell Society, as also to Dr. Andrew Chandler and the Bell Group. Much is owing to these two groups in securing a justly honourable legacy for our saintly bishop, regarded as one of the heroes and worthies of the Church of England, with his own annual celebration in our liturgical calendar. Accordingly, we gather today in a spirit of thanksgiving and with much of our confidence restored in the Church as a place in which justice may be found. And we do not need to revisit the terrible mistakes that were made and the shoddy internal investigations that were undertaken. Happily, we have moved on, and lessons have been learnt, and we must always take to heart Professor David Jasper's words in his paper, A Reflection on Bishop George Bell, that we are all at risk in a society that leaps too quickly to conclusions of guilt before a proper, disciplined examination of the matter is carried out. There are certainly matters that need to be looked into after this protracted case. They include the justifiable anxiety on the part of many clergy as to what might happen to them if a complaint against them is made, and the consequent effect upon their families. Many troubling reports have been received of the treatment of accused individuals, even when the police have decided there is no case to answer. Much of this has come about as a result of a change to the traditional assumption that someone is innocent until proved guilty. All too often, the opposite is now the case, and there is a tacit assumption of guilt. There is also a feeling of being judged on the basis of what is known as historical imperialism. We tend to judge people by today's standards and not in terms of the culture and accepted practice of their own time. Charles Moore, writing in the Daily Telegraph in January 2019, argued that safeguarding bodies should operate under legal discipline at every stage, with their decisions and the language they use affording justice to the accused as well as to the complainant. Archbishop Welby clearly came to recognise this. Is it to be hoped that we can be confident that such concerns are being seriously addressed and that we are moving to a more healthy situation? We want to be inspired once again by Bell's life and his emphasis on repentance, forgiveness, and social justice. As we recall his extensive work for social justice, especially for German refugees to Britain at a time when British people were as hostile to refugees as they are today, it is pleasing to see a continuation of Bishop Bell's charitable work here in his cathedral city in recent times. Perhaps this spirit of neighbourliness could also be encouraged in our modern communities. George Bell often asked the question, "Who is my neighbour?" My neighbour is a Methodist, a Lutheran, a Roman Catholic, a Serbian Orthodox, a Hindu like Gandhi. My neighbour is a painter, sculptor, poet. And my neighbour is a Jewish refugee arriving without home or money. The Germans and British who are being bombed, and underpaid council workers. In the liturgical calendar of the Church of England for the 3rd of October, Bishop Bell is described as bishop, ecumenist, and peacemaker. He worked tirelessly among the churches in Europe, and with the life and work movement, of which he was a sometime president, even as late as 1955, he made a pioneering visit to Milan for talks with Cardinal Mottini, who 8 years later was to become the reforming Pope Paul VI. The strong ecumenical links that we continue to enjoy in Chichester began in George Bell's time. Elsewhere in the church, a marked reduction in some ecumenical work and contacts has been witnessed in the last 2 decades. We might with benefit look to George Bell for encouragement to redouble our current efforts in this vital area of activity in the churches. At a time when central funding for the arts has been considerably cut, we need to recall how important Bishop Bell believed it was for the church to give its blessing and encouragement to the arts. Artwork inspired by George Bell is to be found in Chichester Cathedral and in many of the churches of his former diocese, some of it by the German refugee Hans Freibuch. The bishop regarded art as a form of worship and recognized that it should not be elitist. While the church today sets a good example in promoting the arts in its buildings and among its own members, we also need to give greater support to dedicated artists and musicians in wider society. They enrich our lives and they raise our sights in today's complex and troubled world. There are so many other ways of drawing on the legacy of George Bell, as other speakers will have argued. For my part, I hope that we can continue our recent practice of meeting on the 8th of October each year, George Bell's Day, for a special evensong and address in a London church. This pattern might be replicated in other national centres. I was privileged to serve on the governing body of Bishop Bell's School in Eastbourne, now St Catherine's College, for over a decade, and to be its chair for some years, in fact 4 years. The school had been opened in 1958 by HRH Princess Margaret and dedicated by a rather frail Bishop Bell as his last act as Bishop of Chichester at the close of a 29-year episcopate. He died shortly afterwards. He had specifically requested that the school be built in Langley, a less affluent and expanding area of Eastbourne. Whenever I entered that building, which housed his mitre, his crozier, and his portrait, I always felt that the spirit of this truly great bishop was alive. Our faith assures us that he still prays for us as we continue to give life for his life, thanks for his life, work, and witness. In his excellent tribute to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, another courageous bishop who spoke out against injustice, the present Archbishop of Canterbury quoted some of Tutu's words, which could have come from the mouth of George Bell. Goodness is stronger than evil. Love is stronger than hate. Light is stronger than darkness. Life is stronger than death. Victory is ours through him who loves us.
Well, after that wonderful tribute, I'm going to become very much more local and talk about Chichester itself. I've lived and worshipped with diocese for a large part of my life. I became more deeply involved in the cathedral when I retired some 25 years ago. And at that time, I became and have continued as a volunteer in various roles. I trained as a cathedral guide, although my most active role was as head doorkeeper, which I did for 19 years. This work comprised oversight of a team of approximately 170 volunteers who were responsible for providing a special welcome for our many visitors. We established a high reputation for the warmth and friendliness of our welcome, as well as a knowledge of cathedral history. I am no longer a welcomer or doorkeeper, but am still active as a cathedral guide, which I much enjoy. The inevitable outcome of this activity meant that I built up a considerable knowledge about and understanding of the thoughts and feelings of our whole cathedral community. Now, I must say at this point that what I'm about to say is purely my own thoughts and opinions. I'm not here on behalf of the cathedral community, although I'm very conscious that what I'm about to say does reflect probably the views of a very high proportion of volunteers who operate in the cathedral. We were much shocked to learn about the accusations made about Bishop George Bell, and many people were deeply distressed at the destruction of Bell's reputation by the church authorities with very doubtful evidence. The Archbishop stated at that time that there remains a shadow over Bell's life and reputation. The subsequent investigation was seen to be very sketchy and not always well attended by those people who would have been around Bell at the time of the supposed events. Further in-depth investigation by eminent lawyers was totally disregarded. Most recently, the Archbishop has withdrawn his first statement and stated that he made a mistake. So far, there has been no follow-up to the announcement by the Archbishop, no follow-up from Bishop or Dean here in our cathedral. And this failure to speak about Bell after the Archbishop's statement has caused considerable distress in our cathedral here. It is felt now that the church, both nationally and locally, should very publicly restore the Bell reputation and acknowledge his work for good throughout his ministry. Chichester, sadly, continues to live under an unwarranted shadow which dominates our lives. We need to feel confident again of our history. We need to look forward with pride to our future, and I believe this can only be achieved by restoration of the great name of Bishop George Bell and the fine reputation. And this must be done not sometime, maybe, whenever, but it must be done now, today, in order that we can hold up our heads with pride. Thank you. Right, this is Christopher's statement. I'm sorry not to be able to attend this year's Building Bridges conference, especially as it must surely mark the long-awaited turning point in our campaign for justice for George Bell. Archbishop Welby, having dispelled the cloud over George Bell's memory, there can be no logical reason for that memory to continue to be trashed. So I'm full of hope that by the time you read this, everything will be done to salvage as much as possible of Bishop Bell's fine reputation. I must pay tribute to Richard Simons for his dedication during the long, dark days when justice seemed a long way off. And our initial hopes after Lord Carlisle's report led to precisely nothing being done, and all went quiet. Richard it was who blew on the dying embers and never let what became only a tiny flame go out. I'm sad that David Hopkinson did not live to see the realization of his hopes that his friend Bishop Bell would have his memory restored untarnished. As prime mover in putting to good use the sisters' surplus funds in converting George Bell House, David had deep longing for its name to be restored to George Bell House, the name chosen by the sisters themselves. I share a personal interest in that hope, as if there is a failure to restore the name in my short remaining lifetime, the cathedral will lose a £50,000 legacy from my will. Finally, I misjudged Archbishop Welby. My fear was that his insistence on a cloud over Bishop Snell's name had become an entrenched view. It takes a big man to recant in the way he did, and he is deserving of our sincere gratitude.
I have a note from David Lamming, which precedes Martin Sewell's statement. And this is what David Lamming wrote to us. While not intending to attend your conference on the 1st of February, I'm happy to endorse, support, put my name to the short statement Martin Sewell has sent you. And I will now read Martin Sewell's statement with my glasses on. The defence of Bishop Bell has proved to be a watershed in the life of the Church of England. The process that led to him being accused was deeply flawed, and this was apparent from the outset to anyone with the slightest experience of safeguarding in the secular world. Even so, it took a lengthy campaign across many institutions to restore the bishop's reputation. It is only recently that the Archbishop of Canterbury acknowledged that his initial failure to accept the decision of the independent review was a mistake. I knew little of George Bell until I began critiquing the way he had been treated by the Church, which he faithfully served with distinction. Knowing more now, I suspect he would be pleased to know that as a result of our joint efforts, many who have suffered at the hands of the Church have been emboldened to fight for justice. Survivors were among the first to agree with us that secret process makes for bad outcomes. They knew instinctively that a church willing to sacrifice one of its great saints for a cheap reputational win was no friend of theirs. Since then, we've been inspired to carry the process of reform forward on a number of fronts, but much remains to be done. Church integrity really matters. Richard Harries, Lord Harries of Pentragarth. I would like to express my admiration and gratitude to those who fought so tenaciously to clear the name of Bishop George Bell. Their example of pursuing the truth in the face of opposition has been in the best tradition of George Bell himself. We need to keep his memory and examples alive in relation to the many pressing issues of our own time. And I congratulate the organisers of these events for doing just that in these 2022 conferences. And this from Frank Field, Lord Field of Birkenhead. I want you to know that I'm with you in spirit, and that I hope our next success will be to see George Bell's name remounted in every place where it was taken down. I wish this conference every success in its endeavours. And this is from Daniel Hodson. He's the chairman, as many of you will know, of Chichester Cathedral's roof appeal. Bishop George Bell is one of my great ecclesiastical heroes, and I'm totally supportive of this conference's objectives. And from the Reverend Peter Mullen, all good wishes for a good conference. This is another very important, very beautiful statement from David Jasper. This is another very important, very beautiful statement from David Jasper. That's the Reverend Canon Professor Jasper. I don't know, did any of you come to the 5th of October 2018 conference at Church House? Yes. Yes, well, you may remember, you will certainly remember, you may remember how well he spoke. He spoke beautifully. And so it's a particular privilege to read this from David, who is, you will know, the brother-in-law of Nicholas Reed. There should be no more to be said regarding the unhappy episode of the accusations made against Bishop George Bell. It is over, with hurt on all sides, and those who still refuse to close the door on it will have to live with their own consciences. What it has shown us, among other things, is that we are all at risk in a society that leaps too quickly to conclusions of guilt before a proper, disciplined examination of the matter is carried out. In a culture where undeniably there is much cruelty and crime committed against innocent victims, among them children, it certainly behoves us to be attentive and infinitely careful. But that must never be at the cost of justice, a meticulous attention to truth, and an ultimate desire for reconciliation. Second, it has shown us that the church, not least, must lead in teaching a gospel of love and reconciliation for all, and that this will almost certainly involve each one of us absorbing the hard lesson that we must admit that we have. At times, be mistaken, for without this lesson, a mistaken judgment can easily lead to something worse, festering into further wrongdoing, and it is never easy. But let us now remind ourselves of Bishop Bell as a priest and as a statesman. As I write, the world is mourning the death of another great churchman, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now and then, the Christian church is blessed with a truly great leader. This is not to be understood in terms of managerialism or political acumen and influence. Rather, it is the kind of leadership that draws us back to the fundamental principles of Christian faith and life, in a fierce and uncompromising stand against injustice, in a burning love for humanity, and especially where humanity is ground down by poverty or oppression, in a steadfast adherence to our Lord's teaching that we must be prepared to forgive and forgive again, even when that seems impossible. Bell and Tutu were two very different men. The one shy and studious, the other a dynamic force of life, as full of laughter as of anger against the cruelty that divides person from person. And yet they were the same at heart. I've been a priest for far too long to care very much what bishops and archbishops think of me, but I respond readily and thankfully when I see the true priestly life lived out as Bell and Tutu lived it. And for them, I am indeed truly grateful for their example and real leadership. In June 1942, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote to George Bell about meeting him. They were destined never to meet again. He wrote these words: "The spirit of fellowship and of Christian brotherliness will carry me through the darkest hours. The impression of these days was so overwhelming that I cannot express them in words. I feel ashamed when I think of all your goodness, and at the time, I feel full of hope for the future." Within less than a year, Bonhoeffer was incarcerated in Terkel prison awaiting trial. He was never released, but died by hanging in Flossenbürg concentration camp. But that goodness inspires hope, and that hope can never be extinguished. After Bell's death, Lord Longford spoke on the BBC of the bishop as a statesman in the House of Lords during the war. Bell was not, according to Lord Longford, a particularly popular speaker. A number of his fellow peers finding him so acutely irritating that they could hardly bear to listen in silence. Yet for all that, he was a saintly man. So what was it in this mild, saintly priest that people found so irritating? Lord Longford seeks to explain. It was partly his manner. It was a mild manner, and yet immensely assured, with none of the mock diffidence with which the professional parliamentarian commends himself. But more fundamentally, I think it was because the politician, even if he be a real statesman, is concerned so much with expediency and reasons of state and things like that, which seem to play no part whatever in the bishop's philosophy. In our present time of chaotic, dishonest politics and the absence of any genuine leadership in church and state, this is a deeply telling comment. There is no playing to the gallery, no courting of approval or popularity, no escape into the false haven of expediency, for the truth is harsh, hard, and often hard to find. My father's biography of Bell concludes this discussion of Bell's work during the Second World War with a rather sad comment. Passed over for preferment to either Canterbury or London, Bell harboured no resentment. Nevertheless, he was conscious at this time of a sense of isolation which left a personal mark upon him, and it was a sense of this, a sense of which those who were close to him were well aware. In the light of all that has happened around the figure of George Bell in the last few years, we would do well to reflect upon this comment. None of us, if we are honest, ever becomes the person whom we would wish to be. That might mean trivially, yet nonetheless painfully, being overlooked for preferment. But maybe, much more significantly, knowing that such preferment as we have in life is barely warranted, for we are never quite up to it. There are those who never learn this lesson, and they are the lesser men and women for it. Bell was not one of them. He was not a man without faults. He would have been the first to admit that, as all of us must. But he was a leader who taught by humility, a steely resolution, and a passion for truth, unity, and reconciliation. If in the last years his spirit has been disturbed, may he rest in peace.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Sandra, for inviting me to contribute to this occasion. And I want to start by wishing everybody a happy new year. If you weren't aware of the fact, it is in fact the Chinese New Year. And I take an interest in these things because I've got a Chinese daughter-in-law out with her husband, my son, in Hong Kong, and 2 grandchildren. And it's the year of the tiger, and I thought that was quite interesting because I took the opportunity just a moment ago to look up the collective noun of tigers, thinking that we might consider ourselves to be a bunch of tigers, and it's called an ambush. I've absolutely no idea who we might want to ambush, but there we go. So I've begun on this rather personal note and continue in that vein just for a moment, because I've travelled here this morning, or actually yesterday, and stayed over, not from my own home in Southampton, but from Essex, where I've been visiting my mother. She's now 101 years old, and God willing, will be celebrating her 102nd birthday in 2 months. Like many people, her memory is beginning to play a few tricks on her. She's difficulty remembering what day of the week it is or what she had for breakfast, but she can remember the 1930s and 1940s with great clarity and detail, and it's been fascinating to talk to her about her life at that time. She was born in 1920, a year which recorded the highest number of births ever or since. At the age of 19, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, and her fiancé, later her husband, and even later my father, joined the Territorial Army. He was part of the British Expeditionary Force, which went to France in 1939 after Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany on the 3rd of September of that year. In May 1940, he was one of the 338,000 rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk during Operation Dynamo. Like many who served during the war, he hardly ever spoke about his experiences. My mother met my father whilst working at the engineering company Nestles, where he was an accountant and she a typist. She was in London during the Blitz, although the company moved to Nottingham. Her typing skills were put to good use when she joined the ATS, and she, of course, many others, typed out the battle plans for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of mainland Europe. I guess she's broken the Official Secrets Act by talking to me about these things, but I doubt if she'll end up in prison. Well, I'd hope not. Operation Overlord on June the 6th, 1944 was the largest air, land and sea operation undertaken before or since. Now I want to move on and talk about the carpet bombing of German cities in the Second World War. In his Zurich lectures, Air, War and Literature, W.G. Siebold, a German author and academic, provides an overview of the carpet bombing of German cities in the Second World War by Allied air forces. Today it is hard to form an even partly adequate idea of the extent of the devastation suffered by the cities of Germany in the last years of the Second World War. Still harder to think about the horrors involved in that devastation. It is true that the strategic bombing surveys published by the Allies, together with the records of the Federal German Statistics Office and other official services, show that the Royal Air Force alone dropped 1 million tons of bombs on enemy territory. That of the 131 towns and cities attacked, some only once and some repeatedly, many were almost entirely flattened. That about 600,000 German civilians fell victim to the air raids, and that 3.5 million homes were destroyed. While at the end of the war, 7.5 million people were left homeless, and there were 30 cubic meters of rubble for every person in Cologne, and 43 cubic meters for every inhabitant of Dresden. But we do not grasp what it actually meant. The sheer scale of the raids in both number and size is difficult to comprehend. Some raids had 1,000 aircraft, and bombs were both explosive, up to 1 ton in weight, and incendiary, which led to the devastating firestorms. And this is, if you can read it, a resume of the bombing effort in terms of both the work of the United States on the left and the Royal Air Force in red on the right. Tons of bombs dropped, the number of sorties, planes lost, personnel lost, and of course there was a huge loss of life from the RAF, who were rightly considered as great heroes. And the critics that I'm reading from of the aerial bombing make great pains to say that they're not criticising the personnel as such, but the policy of the government. Seaborg goes on to reflect upon the complete absence of any critique of the Allied bombings of Dresden on February 1945 by German writers, despite the outspoken criticism by leaders in Great Britain. Quote, but in contrast to the mainly passive reaction of the Germans to the loss of their cities, which they perceived as an inescapable calamity, the programme of destruction was vigorously debated from the first in Great Britain. Not only did Lord Salisbury and George Bell, Bishop of Chichester, repeatedly and very forcibly express the opinion, both in the House of Lords and to the general public, that an attacking strategy directed primarily against the civilian population could not be defended morally or by the laws of war, but the military establishment responsible for conducting the campaign was itself split over this new kind of warfare. The continuing ambivalence in the appraisal of the Battle of Annihilation was even more pronounced after Germany's unconditional surrender. As accounts and pictures of the effects of area bombing began to appear in England, there was a growing sense of revulsion against damage that had been, so to speak, indiscriminately inflicted. In the safety of peace, writes Max Hastings, the bombers' part in the war was one that many politicians and civilians would prefer to forget. Retrospective historical accounts do not clear up the ethical dilemma either. Feuds between various factions were continued in memoirs, and the verdict of historians trying to maintain an objective balance swings between admiration for the organisation of such a mighty enterprise and criticism of the futility and atrocity of an operation mercifully carried out to the end against the dictates of good sense. Next section, was it a crime? A.C. Grayling, in his book Among the Dead Cities, Is the Targeting of Civilians in War Ever Justified?, has considered this question in meticulous detail and depth. Quoting again, in the course of the Second World War, the air forces of Britain and the United States of America carried out a massive bombing offensive against the cities of Germany and Japan, ending with the destruction of Dresden and Tokyo, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was this bombing offensive a crime against humanity, or was it justified by the necessities of war? These questions mark one of the great remaining controversies of the Second World War. It is a controversy which has grown during the decades since the war ended, as the benefit of hindsight has prompted fresh examination of the quotes, area bombing strategy. The strategy of treating whole cities and their civilian populations as targets for attack by high explosive and incendiary bombs, and in the end by atom bombs. Part of the reason why the area bombing controversy continues to grow is that in today's Germany and Japan, people are beginning to speak about what their parents and grandparents endured in the bombing attacks, and to see them as victims too, to be counted amongst the many who suffered during the immense global conflict. What should we, the descendants of the Allies who won the victory in the Second World War, reply to the moral challenge of the descendants of those whose cities were targeted by Allied bombers? Peter Hitchens, journalist and columnist for the Mail on Sunday, and as I'm sure you know, a great supporter of this organisation, wrote that, quotes again, "The late Bishop George Bell, incomparably the greatest figure produced by the Church of England in modern times. He was a friend and sponsor of the arts in the service of God. He was among those who first discovered the genius of Gerald Manley Hopkins. He encouraged T.S. Eliot to write his great play, Murder in the Cathedral. Later, he was among the first to see the menace of National Socialism in Germany, tirelessly spoke for those persecuted there when this was an unfashionable and awkward cause, and became a close friend of the martyred Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And then, in the face of sour hostility from Winston Churchill, he publicly attacked the policy of bombing German civilians in their homes, to this day a divisive and painful issue in Britain. This almost certainly prevented him from becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, a post he would greatly have adorned." End quotes. As the title of his article intimates, Peter Hitchens wrote those words under the title, "A Church That Was." It is largely a lament on the present state of the Church of England and the contrast between its leadership now and the period leading up to and during the Second World War. Conclusion. It is important to note that Bell, while obviously horrified at the loss of human life, was also deeply concerned about the damage to libraries and art galleries and so on. In his speech to the House of Lords on the 9th of February 1944, which I've reproduced in the written version of this as an appendix, but I'm not going to read it now. He was also concerned about the long-term implications of the bombing when the Allies would be contributing to post-war reconstruction. Speaking out against this strategy demanded enormous courage, and it made him deeply unpopular and probably affected his career. I conclude as I started on a personal note. For several years in the early 1970s, I, with my wife, were leaders for the Southampton International Youth Rally. Set up shortly after the end of hostilities, it was an exchange program for teenagers from Southampton and Hamburg, later extended to several other European countries. The youngsters would spend a fortnight hosting their German visitors and then travel to Hamburg to be hosted in turn. So I've been to Hamburg on a couple of occasions through that initiative. And the International Youth Rally, IYR as we called it, was a courageous initiative exhibiting many of the fine qualities possessed by George Bell. Sadly, by the time we became involved, the teenagers from the different countries were virtually indistinguishable in dress and culture, another sharp reminder of the contrast between Bell's generation and our current times. Thank you.
Well, this statement is from the Reverend Dr. Alan Gadd, a great supporter of the Society. I think he's been to all our conferences, except this one. He couldn't come to this one, but he came to the other three, and this is what he sent me to say today. I have the highest regard for Bishop Bell because of the moral courage and action at personal cost regarding British government tactics in the Second World War, a regard augmented by the testimony of Canon Ivor Smith Cameron. Bishop Bell ordained Ivor deacon in 1954 and priest in 1955. On both occasions, Ivor stayed for several days at the bishop's residence, where the bishop and his wife, Henrietta, hosted the ordinands for their retreats. As Canon Ivor wrote on the 4th of October 2008, to have been ordained by Bishop Bell is one of the greatest privileges of my life. A prophet well ahead of his time, he taught me two unforgettable insights. Excuse me. First, the Christian ecumenical movement was for him not an end in itself, but an opening into the wider ecumenism of people of all faiths, and eventually all humankind and all creation. Second, devout churchman that he was, he repeatedly reminded me, excuse me, that the world and not the church was the main focus of divine activity. Our priority now is to see Bishop Bell's name restored to the public expressions it had before the errors of the past few years. George Bell House at 4 Cannon Lane is the first on our list. I'd like to add a very personal note to that, because Canon Ivor, actually said a prayer at the first 3 conferences we had. And I can remember how he spoke. He said very few words, and every word mattered. Richard will remember this. An absolutely wonderful, quiet, dedicated Christian.
I'm Geoffrey Boys. Now, I was an Ofsted inspector, and I was the registered inspector for the first secondary school Ofsted inspection in 1993. And it was the first opportunity for parents to write to the inspectors before the inspection and to say, raise any issues that they had about the school. There was also the first opportunity for parents to come after the inspection so that they could talk to meet the inspectors and talk to them about the school. I'm going to talk about whistleblowing, and I'm going to bring us back to the present and the aim of this conference, which is to consider ways of restoring Bishop Bell's proper place in history, ensuring that the name of George Bell House is restored and all other places where his name has been taken down, reaffix his name. And I want to bring you to the paragraph in the audit report that the Cathedral have just received from the Social Care Institute for Excellence, that's the SCIE, Social Care Institute for Excellence. And that indicates what needs to be done now. It says, and I take a paragraph which I believe is relevant now. The Cathedral whistleblowing policy and procedure is not adequate for reporting concerns about safeguarding matters. Its location as an annex to the safeguarding policy, which has no index, its restrictions as applying only to Cathedral employees, and the lack of ability to search for it on the Cathedral website makes it unlikely to be used. It would be helpful to consider how a potential whistleblower might raise a concern if it related to the Cathedral's senior leadership, including members of the chapter. That is all on the Cathedral website now, and it's there at the end of this report. The Archbishop's recent statement about George Bell has made it clear that there is now no controversy. However, the SCIE report also says that these decisions are still proving controversial for some. Was this statement in the report negotiated with the cathedral, or is it still the view that some members of the chapter, that there is still a controversy? The Dean has responded. He says the cathedral has begun to take action, some of the suggested changes, and working with the diocesan safeguarding team, the chapter will soon be responding with its safeguarding action plan. What will this plan say about changing the culture of the cathedral so that a potential whistleblower might raise such a concern? It's a quirk of fortune that I have tried to blow a whistle 3 times in 3 very high-profile cases during the last, well, it's going back 40 years. They all reached the headlines of the news in the BBC News. On each occasion, in retrospect, I should have blown the whistle more loudly.
Any questions, anybody?
Jim, did you say you were a whistleblower in the George Bell case?
Yes, I was.
And which whistle did you blow?
I mentioned in the Bryden report, and so you will all know about it. I mentioned by name in the Bryden report. My name is spelled B-O-Y-S. In the Bryden report, it's spelled B-U-O-Y-E-S, which is an interesting naval connection, perhaps. But I mentioned in the report, the clergyman who came and whistleblowed beside me is not mentioned by name. And I wasn't alerted to the fact that I was going to be mentioned by name. And I felt there should have been some follow-up to my blowing of the whistle on that occasion.
Which particular aspect of the report were you keen to see exposed further?
Well, the question of, since George Bell was innocent, the question is, was it a misremembrance or was it a misidentification? And I was talking about the possibility of misidentification, but it must have been either one of those two. Richard.
Would you hazard a guess at who might have abused Carol? It seems clear to me that, yes, Carol was abused by somebody within the cathedral, but it wasn't Bishop Bell. That raises rather quite a disturbing question, which is, if it wasn't Bishop Bell, who was it? I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, Jeffrey.
Can I first thank Richard for 4 years of interesting correspondence at all levels. I think our emails must count in hundreds. He's been a wonderful support, and together with Sandra, it's been a very interesting 4 years, and sometimes a considerably traumatic 4 years, as I've wondered whether to say more or whether to hope that I'd said enough. The issue that Richard raises is, I believe, in the public arena, and it is perfectly possible, and I said this 2 years ago, for somebody to come back. We met 2 years ago here in Chichester, and it was perfectly possible for somebody to come back and to look at the question of misidentification. But that was not a purpose of the Bryden report. They were not to look at the misidentification. And so the key issue was whether my suspect was more likely than Bishop Bell. And to take you back to the moment when I first thought about my subject, it must have been a year before I came forward. But when I came forward, I still knew little about my suspect. Subsequently, what I suggested to Lord Carlisle has proved to be much more credible than anything else that has been suggested. And the key point, of course, was that it wasn't a member of the cathedral staff, and it was somebody who worked outside for the cathedral.
See, these are disturbing and they're very sensitive issues. We're all aware how sensitive it might be. The rebuilding bridges, as it were, vision has been one of rebuilding bridges and in the spirit of cooperation and in healing. My own personal view, which might or might not be shared, is that for that reconciliation and healing to take place, these questions need to be faced rather, and it is unfortunate that there is locally, as it were, a silence relating to who might have been the abuser. I think, I'm aware Desmond Tutu has been mentioned, and of course that's linked with Nelson Mandela, and they, in order to, as it were, heal the rifts within South Africa, they set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that was their way of trying to heal those very deep divisions within South Africa and beyond. I think that something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission needs to be done within Chichester in order to achieve the real healing and reconciliation and healing of divisions. So I think that must be
Can I finish with a final word to the cathedral guides? There is, if you search for guided tours of the cathedral on the cathedral website, it still reads like this. Whilst we strongly recommend you book a tour of the cathedral with a cathedral guide, if you choose to deliver a self-guided tour while planning your visit, please be aware of news about Bishop George Bell, first publicised in October 2015. And that's the end of it.
When this news first broke in 2015, we, the guides, were expressly forbidden to even mention the name George Bell in the cathedral. And as you probably know, flowers put by his memorial were expressly removed, and any reference to George Bell, particularly for George Bell House, was actually expressly forbidden. Not many of us obeyed that, I have to say, but in recent months, I understand there has been a lessening of that instruction, but it hasn't been really well publicised, and I don't think we're aware of it, because we're plying our own furrow anyhow. But obviously the cathedral cannot go on sticking to that particular regulation made 5 years ago. So we're waiting for an official announcement, which doesn't come. And I wonder if, in the light of that, this meeting, this conference, should be able to perhaps pass a resolution, which is sent to the bishop and maybe the dean as well, requesting that Bishop Bell's reputation be reinstated. It would make life much easier for everybody. I mean, apart from the fact that it should be done anyhow, morally it should be done, but also we need the decks cleared on this. It's a very grey area.
Jeremy, who do you think is responsible for issuing the ultimate recovery plan. Is this a diocesan matter, or is it a cathedral matter? In other words, is the bishop actually
I think it was probably 2 years ago, we did have a meeting in George Bell House, which the bishop attended. Was it? I think it wasn't a building. Anyhow, it was a different meeting. There were about 30 of us there. The bishop was asked to come. He said he was very busy, but he would come. He spoke for half an hour, in fact, giving us a lecture,
Yes.
which was...
It was the Bell Society conference on the 4th of February 2019.
Oh, well, you've got it all, Sandra, thank you. Anyhow, the bishop did speak. At the end, he said, no questions, I've got to go to a meeting in Brighton. And one lady, I don't know who it was, do you know who it was? Stood up at the back and said, can you tell us where you're going to restore the name to a four-pound name, call it George Bell House? And he said, well, I have no authority in the cathedral. I have influence, but I don't have authority. So the decision about that is purely in
The hands of the chapter.
the hands of the dean.
The bishop is, of course,
So the bishop gets backed away from it. When you talk to the dean about it, which is very difficult to do anyhow, he doesn't like talking about it, his answer is, well, my hands are tied. So they're both denying responsibility for this. But in fact, what ought to happen now from our point of view is the dean ought to make a public announcement that George Bell's name is restored and that we're officially allowed to talk about him and his reputation. But it just does not happen. And that is what we're very concerned about. And I wonder if we cannot now pass a resolution to the bishop, or Bishop and Dean, I'm not quite sure which.
Before we do that, I
But-
think you
but,
wanted to say something.
I mean, the only thing I wanted to say about the cathedral and the bishop, I mean, the bishop is the visitor to the cathedral.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was a diocesan bishop, everybody used to sort of talk about your cathedral. And that, since the Reformation, that's no longer been the case. I always used to say the only thing that's actually mine here is the bishop's cathedra, the throne where the bishop sits. So, you know, we are dealing with this about Bishop Bell, not so much his place in the diocese, but his place in the cathedral. That's where our concern is at the moment. As you know, there's been sort of fresh governance to cathedrals in recent years, and I think that there would be something to be said for opening this up, perhaps a little bit further, and requesting the Cathedral Council to look at this. I mean, you know, there is the chapter, there is the College of Canons, and there is the Cathedral Council. I'm not sure who is actually the chair of the Cathedral Council. The bishop is in attendance at the Cathedral Council. Now, it's well known that some bishops don't go very often, largely because of diary pressure. In my own defence, I have to say, I always gave, when I was Bishop of Blackburn, I gave a strong, a high priority to the Cathedral Council and made sure that I was always there. The bishop certainly gets the minutes of the Cathedral Council, so I think you could consider a motion or a request for clarification from the Cathedral Council.
Do you think we could ask the Archbishop if he'd be prepared to meet members of the Bell Society when he comes here in March?
He is.
Probably the George Bell Group.
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful if perhaps we asked for a meeting with the Bishop of Chichester.
Right. You mean the Bell Society?
Yes, the Bell Society.
Well, but we've tried that. Well, we've had him to our...
Yeah, you have, but I mean, since the Archbishop's statement,
Yes, okay.
I think you know, I see that we're in a new time now.
Yes, we are.
And hopefully we've begun to move on. And I would be very surprised if Bishop Martin wasn't actually prepared to meet you.
Yes, may I just, I do apologise if my appearance is a bit outspoken
In 1 minute.
about this, but I think the issue is very serious. The fact that the chapter has not made a decision about George Bell House is deeply disturbing.
We don't know that they haven't. We don't know the outcome of that meeting.
I can tell you that they haven't, because they had a meeting last Tuesday on which no decision was made.
See, there's a position about the kind of, as it were, the golden thread of justice, which is basically the presumption of innocence, and you've got to be, you're innocent until proven guilty. That's a huge matter of law, and that there's been a miscarriage of justice relating to Bishop Bell and others, and there needs to be a kind of kick up the pants, if for using it diplomatically, for certain people, and saying this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed quickly. It should have been addressed immediately after the Archbishop's pronouncement.
I think that's what you're suggesting.
One was hoping that, as it were, the chapter would further the cause of justice, and not pervert it. And I think it is as serious as that. And as, of course, one meets up with these people, and it's important to do, and it's got to be done in a spirit of reconciliation and healing. But at the same time, there is an urgency. There's been a miscarriage of justice, and that needs to be dealt with fast.
Somebody over there.
Well, what I want to say actually follows on from that kind of thing. If he has no authority as an archbishop over a bishop, as a human being, he could at least talk to the bishop and to the dean about the importance of saying you're wrong and asking for forgiveness for all the trouble that's been caused. I mean, we are in a world of that at the moment, aren't we, with Boris Johnson and all the rest of it. You know, apologies can happen, but they have to be sincere. I mean, I sat in this room, and I know Jeremy was there too, and maybe some other people, just after the announcement was made by Carol, and there were a lot of people here desperately distressed by it all. And the dean, and he was new, poor chap, and it was thrown at him almost as soon as he got here, and that was tough. But there were other people, including our cathedral safeguarding person, who were trying to convince the mass at the end of the hall that George Bell was guilty, because it had been proved that he was guilty, they said. And it was awful, it really was. And there were people, tragically now no longer with us, like Mike Seisland, Colin Clark, Peter Blackwell, Hugh Doggett, very, very upset, grown men, because of the situation that was like that. And I had a long chat with the dean afterwards, as long as chat I've ever had with him. And I talked about when I was a Sunday school teacher at 15, and my father had just died, and I had a long chat with the then Bishop of Bedford, who became Bishop of Jerusalem. Late into the night, we talked for hours. He didn't touch me, but he could have done. And I could have been written to that lady's solicitor who dealt with Carol and told her about it, and we could have made up a story. Now, having said that, I have no doubt that Carol was abused by somebody, but I also am absolutely dead certain it wasn't by George Bell. I mean, she's had her payday. Surely our bishop and dean and all these people can be big enough to restore George Bell's memory. They owe it to the people who gave them money for the house anyway. And to all these people now dead who are so distressed by it all.
If I may say so, I think the worst feature of this current situation, and I mean since the Archbishop's statement, is that there has been total silence from the cathedral. And we as a cathedral community are in limbo. And the morale in the cathedral is plummeting, simply because we've heard nothing. If we just need to be explained why we've heard nothing, that would help.
Indeed.
But not even that. So they can't go on hiding their light. And that's what we really need to tell them.
I was just going to say,
Oh, sorry, Terry.
I looked today on the website for the cathedral, and you'd hardly know George
No.
Bell as
No.
There's nothing on there.
So it's silence as well as the incorrect things. It's definitely been airbrushed out of history.
There's one good feature. The new guidebook produced for the cathedral a few months ago has got quite a section about George Bell.
That's
Which is
good.
that's very comforting.
A replacement.
Yeah.
So these are two statements given by, again, two people who, with Canon Ivor Smith Cameron, always came to the three Bell conferences we had before we had this fourth one. This is from Vasantha Gnanados. My interest in Bishop George Bell began because my father admired him. I'm a member of the Bell Society, the George Bell Society. I find it heartening that 60 years after Bishop George Bell's death, his legacy has united a diverse group of people. This is such a rare gift and shows us his enduring goodness and prophetic qualities. He would recognize the humanity in each one of us. This has been very important at a time when the Church of England has been ineffective in providing spiritual, moral, and theological leadership. The people who've campaigned to reinstate Bishop Bell's good name include powerful advocates, quiet supporters, academics, students, journalists, historians, the outspoken, the calm, the young, the old, and people of different cultures and faiths. This was possible because we learnt from his example. Have you any comment to make on that?
I mean, I would take very seriously anything Vasantha says. I mean, I used to know her quite well when I was in office.
Right. It seemed to me that when she says this has been important at a time when the Church of England has been ineffective in providing spiritual, moral, and theological leadership, seems a bit sort of over the top, really, because I mean there are lots and lots of people in the Church of England who are doing a terrific job.
I think that's true. I think you can push that statement a bit too far. I mean, because there are people in the Church of England who are giving leadership and giving good spiritual direction, and
Yes.
there is a lot in the way of sort of spiritual direction that is offered to people now that wasn't offered before. But I mean, that said, I think she is absolutely right that we don't seem to get or it doesn't seem to be as effective as it was in the past with the leadership from the bishops. But some of that obviously is to do with the culture that we're in.
Surely that will change now that the Archbishop has very bravely recanted as he did, because by recanting, I actually put that in my letter to him, I said that his apology was various things, far-seeing. And I said that because by doing what he did, which was a very courageous thing to do, he's actually opened up the window of the church again And hopefully something really positive will come out of it, and people will start coming back into church again and believing because of what he did. And I do admire him for doing what he did. I've got one more of these. I'm sorry, did you want to say something? I've got one more statement to read out, and this is an important one as well. It's from Dr. Ruth Hildebrandt Grayson, and she says, "I regret being unable to join you on this occasion. However, I hope that your event will help progress the restitution of the name, reputation, and legacy of the late Bishop George Bell, to which I personally remain deeply committed. With many others, I welcomed Archbishop's statement in November 2021, retracting his infamous significant cloud remark, and thus effectively and finally acknowledging Bishop Bell's innocence of the allegation made against him. But words alone are not enough. We now await the promised statue to Bell at Canterbury Cathedral, and are awaiting even more urgently a similar statement and similar moves towards restoration from within the Diocese of Chichester, and especially from the Dean and Chapter of the cathedral here. Bridge rebuilding needs to take place from both sides of a divide. Isn't that a good sentence? I believe that any future Rebuilding Bridges event must involve the participation both of those living more locally than I do, who have been affected much more than even I have by the daily visual reminders of the various attempts to traduce the great bishop's reputation, and by those who alone are in a position to restore them. In the meantime, perhaps I may be allowed to commend to you all the new Bishop George Bell, I'll start that again, I beg your pardon. In the meantime, perhaps I may be allowed to commend to you all the new Bishop George Bell Memorial Fund, hosted by Barnabas Fund, which has been established to enable Bell's work with persecuted refugee converts to Christianity to continue this century. It is my profound prayer that by helping to perpetuate his work in practical ways, the true legacy of the late bishop will eventually be fully recognized. Is Tony Wheatley here? Tony Wheatley?
Yes.
Tony, I wanted to read, if you'll allow me to, or if you would rather read it yourself. Richard, be quiet. Richard, be quiet. Shall I read your poem? Because I know it came out.
I mean, the poet is the worst person to read his own words, I'm sure. So please do.
Is that all right? There you are. I have his permission. Well, this was reminded. Tony, no, I'm going to read it. No, I'm going to read this. Tony,
Yeah.
remind me when this went into the newspaper.
Oh, it was in December, sometime early December.
Yes. No, I'd like to read this. Oh, go on.
Okay. This is from a poem from Tony Wheatley that was published in the Chichester Observer.
When?
And the poem is with thanks to Ralph Hodgson.
And when was it published again? It's important that because it's in the past, so you have to say
Early December.
early December, right?
Early December.
Yeah, that's when it was published in the Chichester Observer.
Last year. Last year.
Yeah.
Okay, this is called Bell of Heaven. 'Twould ring the bell of heaven, the purest chime for years, if prelates gained their senses and clergy came to theirs. For no significant cloud over Bishop Bell of chai spells confusion, obfuscation. A cloud that's insignificant stretches imagination. Ecclesiarchs and minions. Frank's speech we need from you. Dispense with insignificant clouds. Bell's nature's shining through. Do not compound your insult. Do not delay straight talk. Welby, Warner, and your like are saintly bells magnificent. Please tell the world today, George Kennedy Bell is innocent.
This, of course, came out before the Archbishop's recantation, so put that in context.
Yes.
I think my problem with the Archbishop is that he says things like there's no significant cloud. Now, if there isn't a significant cloud, it means there is a cloud. And I think that he should retract that word significant, because it makes nonsense, really. I know a lot of people here probably support him, and they say, he's retracted and he's doing a wonderful thing. But I don't think he's gone far enough.
Does anybody have any comment to make on that? Would you like to say something?
There's a book called No Smoke, No Cloud. It was written as an autobiography of the Southampton manager who was accused of abuse. And the judge, Richard Clark, basically said there are people that are going to say there's no smoke without fire, which a lot of people consider. There's no smoke without fire. And on this particular case with the Southampton manager, lots of things were said, it was a lot of in the paper, but the conclusion of the judge was there's no smoke and there's no fire. And I think that we should say the same here with Bishop Bell. There's no smoke, there's no fire, and there's no cloud. And that needs to be said clearly, because a lot of people basically are saying much the same, oh, there's no smoke without fire. Yeah, we should. Now those kind of people, people who say that, they need to be shot down, basically, metaphorically speaking, of course. They should say, no,